Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third season of Hitchhiker's Guide. And today I got one of the most exciting topics that I know many of you want to know more about. LinkedIn has been abuzz with all sorts of ways of measuring marketing in new, unconventional methods. And today, I want to talk about not doing just something new, replacing what you had with something that they said is better, but actually looking at a holistic way of bringing multiple ways to measure marketing together for a full picture. So we'll talk about everything that you need to know to understand the difference between multi-touch attribution and marketing mix modeling, and why using the two together actually gives you a better idea of how you're doing. And I got a super, super exciting guest who I will bring on stage right now. Joe, welcome. Joe Domaleski, my fellow graduate student. Well, he's graduating. I'm only starting in Georgia Tech, so he's way closer to the finish line. Joe, welcome. Just favor introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. It's exciting to be here. We are going to have so much fun. When Nadia said the title of this thing is The Hitchhiker's Guide to Marketing Analytics, how could I say no to that?
Your answer was 42, remember?
That's right. That is the answer. We're going to talk about the question today.
Phenomenal. Well, Joe, I know that you run a marketing agency, and then actually what you do is the epitome of the premise of the question today, like what is better and why we're here trying to measure what we do as marketers, because you cover kind of two areas of marketing. I've shown the slide before, and I feel like it's so appropriate. You have a creative agency. And, creative side of marketing is all about influencing behaviors, getting people to engage, remember, call on you when the time comes. And yet we're measured by the numbers. We're translating behaviors and audience sentiment into dollars because that's the only way, our leadership understands whether or not we're doing a good job. So, give me your take on kind of balancing this creative side with a scientific side and bring the two together.
Well, being creative is actually part of our company's name, Country Fried Creative. The creative side normally gets most of the attention in marketing. When it comes to the analytics, it's all about the accountability. So, on one side, it's like, this feels right. This is good. What a great campaign. The other side is like, show me the money, show me the revenue. And so finding that balance is so important.
And I feel like this is why ROI is one of those hardest to answer questions. And I mean, I kind of get it. On one side, they give you money and they say, please invest this responsibly, do all the wonderful things that marketing does to drive pipeline. What you do, actually, you make bets. You know what worked yesterday. You hope that it will work tomorrow. But the B2B consumer is a fickle kind. Sentiments change, tools change, market changes. So you try to invest things responsibly. You see behaviors and engagement metrics. But when people ask, what's the ROI on that? How much of that converted to actual opportunities and business deals? Sometimes it takes way longer than when the question comes in. And this stat totally floored me from Gartner that 80% of CMOs say they cannot prove marketing ROI. And I feel like this is why we're here to talk about measuring marketing in ways that actually drive decisions. So it's not just the answer, what is the ROI, but rather, what do I do with it?
Absolutely.
And I will start with this. I think everyone on this event is very familiar with this framework. This is like operational marketing framework. When you go and you report out at your QBR, maybe end of the year deck you put together, there's usually three pillars. I mean, I know personally I've done that a lot. You talk about attribution and you talk about, which touch points within campaigns work the best. And then you can split hair and go into like specific models and the questions that you ask, right? And then optimizing how you invest. You talk about your engagement metrics. Are people actually looking at your stuff? Are they coming to your webinars? Thank you very much, everyone who came. Are they actually, commenting? Are they liking things? Are they resharing? Do they shake your hand at the event? And then you have the funnel metrics. That's what usually your CFO and CEO want to know. How do things convert from when we first talk to them to opportunities? But then, Joe, this is more kind of the land that you have lived in for the last 2 years, building these things yourself from scratch, which, finishing my Python bootcamp, you have a lot of admiration from me being able to do that. Like, you have the strategic framework, you have the bigger kind of level, or the higher level modeling, you have marketing mix modeling, you have multi-touch attribution that allows you kind of see the entire journey for deals that take 2 years, it may take 2 years to close, right? And then you have that continuous testing and incrementality. But I feel like each one of these things always answers a different question, and you have to be mindful of which question you're asking. And there are challenges with each one of those things taken separately as a standalone in a silo. And Joe, I'm curious if you would agree with like the challenges that I jotted down here just from my life as a marketer within BTB, right? One thing sees, something, but doesn't see the entire thing, and you always have to look at everything together.
Absolutely. I think the key point here is that it does require looking at things from different levels, using different tools that, in fact, if you try to, as we're going to talk about later, try to add up what each of these approaches measures, you'll get something greater than 100%, which we know is not true.
By the way, for everyone on this call, in the resources section, I shared a link to an amazing, amazing blog that Joe writes that talks about everything data science for marketing. Actually, that was the compelling event in my life that kind of prompted me to reach out to Joe and say, hey, Joe, I would love for you to talk about this on Hitchhiker's Guide, because a lot of what you will hear throughout this session, Joe touched on it on his blog. So feel free to go look at it. I mean, amazing, very in-depth written articles. I don't know where you find the time. But with this, like, why don't we go into this measurement gap? So, Joe, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. I am so excited to be here. I have done a number of podcasts, video casts, webinars. This is my first time being here on Hitchhiker's Guide. I'm actually sitting in my living room. So this, for those of you tuned in right now, this is live. For those of you watching it later, it won't be live. So anything can happen in a live broadcast, including my DOG who is sitting at my feet. I hope I've taken care of him so he won't pop up and interrupt this video webinar. So let's just dive right into this. So Nadia and I got to meet each other virtually. We are both affiliated with Georgia Tech. Go Jackets. A couple years ago, at the tender age of 57, I decided to go back to grad school and study analytics. Now, I own a marketing agency. We're celebrating our 23rd year in business. And honestly, most of what we've done has focused on the creative part. But as we look at numbers and analytics and challenges, I thought, I want to go back to school and learn some of that. So I'm actually finishing up this summer, and Nadia is getting ready to start the same journey, and it is fun to be in school and learn some of this stuff. So what we're going to talk about today will be a review for some of you. It will be new for others. And really my goal in participating today is hopefully to spark some new ideas, some new ways of thinking. Now, when we talk about analytics, when we talk about these different tools, including this webinar software tool, which I am also learning for the first time. It's kind of like I love science fiction. Of course, it's why I'm on this irresistible webinar. It's kind of like arguing, which is better, Star Wars or Star Trek? And we know the real answer to that is Dune. Dune beats them both. And so when it comes to finding the measurement gaps, is the Enterprise faster than the Millennium Falcon? I don't know. They're both fast. Who would win, Battlestar Galactica or one of the highliners from Dune. Again, I don't know, but when we're looking at marketing analytics, you really need some solid tools in the toolkit to help you do your job. Multi-touch attribution, that's what MTA stands for. And don't be bashful. Those of you that are tuning in, you're like, I've been in marketing for 5 years. I've been in it for 1 year. I've been in it for 20 years. You will see and hear terms that you have never heard of, or perhaps you're too embarrassed to ask what that means. I was in a meeting once, and somebody leaned over and said, "Hey, Joe," we were doing their website. "We really need to install KPIs on our website." And I could tell by the context that this young lady had no idea that that was a key performance indicator. She actually thought it was like a plug-in or a piece of code that you put into a website. And so I gently answered that question by defining the term. So I will try to do that as we get into this. But attribution, let's just peel away the MTA part of it and just focus on the attribution. For me, I like to tell people that is the street level view of marketing. It is the way that is up close, detailed, and very tactical. It's very explainable. When you are tracking the different touch points in a conversion or whatever your goal is to get somebody to buy something or fill out a form or whatever that conversion goal is, it is a way to kind of measure those touch points and distribute credit. Now, there are a bunch of different ways to do that. It reminds me, if you've ever had an accounting class and you start talking about depreciation. Do you do FIFO or LIFO or spread it out evenly? When it comes to attribution, you can do that. Do you credit the top of the funnel? Do you credit the back of the funnel? Do you distribute it evenly? And we won't get into all that in this webinar, but just know that there's a lot of different ways to track things, and attribution is normally the place that is most obvious and most intuitive for people to figure out what's going on with the marketing. When you look at a more top-down approach, we start getting into something called media mix modeling, and I'm going to go ahead and commingle the term marketing mix modeling. There is a little bit of a distinction between the two, but I'm going to kind of talk about the MMM in aggregate. So if MTA or attribution is bottom up, think of MMM or media or marketing mix modeling is the top down satellite view. And this really, I'll be honest, it's a relatively old concept that's kind of gotten new again because the tools have gotten better. And underneath the hood, and we're actually gonna have Nadia and I worked hard on this presentation for you guys today. It's amazing. I put together some notes, and out comes this awesome slide deck. We do have a little bit of math in here just because I know there'll be some folks online that like to see at least one equation. You can't not have at least one equation, but we're going to keep most of the dialogue pretty high level. The marketing mix model is something, even though it's old, it's kind of new again. A lot of people haven't heard of it. And so when we look at the top down, we're actually looking at everything. And we're not kind of doing a bottom up where we can say, well, we track that click all the way through. We're looking at everything. And I actually think it's a little bit more intuitive than an attribution type model, because we know that things tend to have a lingering effect. So when we look at marketing mix models, we're actually talking about something that maybe some of you learned in school. Nadia's getting ready to study it a lot more, and I've been knee deep in it, and that's regression. Regression is the original, the OG of machine learning. It is. Now, when I first learned regression, I'm going to date myself. Well, I already told you how old I am. In the 80s, right? We didn't use the term machine learning. Back then, AI was expert systems. We didn't really have neural nets. Um, Now people look at regression, and it's still very much used, and it is really the heart of a marketing model like this, where we're looking at everything, right? We're not looking at touch points or people's. We're looking at macro spend, and we can look at digital marketing and traditional marketing and seasonality and other factors that we know come into play, for marketing. So, as I said before, it's kind of like the satellite view of marketing. And again, we're going to just keep trying to put little space analogies and humor into this. So, if MTA or multi-touch attribution is a street view, think of this as the orbital intelligence, right? So, I don't know about all of you, but I was absolutely mesmerized by the Artemis mission. Okay. I'm old enough that I remember some of the final Apollo missions to the moon. And I drank Tang for breakfast, and I was actually wanted to be an astronaut. Little did I know that I was gonna, own a marketing agency full of millennial and Gen Z women. Go figure. That's just how life unfolds, but I wanted to be an astronaut. So, we'll put all these little space analogies in here. So, when you're looking at a kind of an orbital view, a satellite view, it's really kinda hard to tell, zoom in and see who's parked badly, right? Okay, that guy's parked crooked. If you're MTA, you're street level and go, okay, Joe's not in between the lines, but you can see neighborhoods and you can see lights and patterns, and so it's not magic, but it allows you to see things from a very high level. But that's also where it falls short. You don't get that granularity. So you can't say that, this particular ad creative won the day or that audience segment. But you can say, hey, advertising, contributed to this, or this campaign or this social media and that sort of thing. So if you're following along, bottom up, MTA, attribution, top down, you've got marketing or media mix models. And therein lies kind of, okay, we need two different views. Now, Nadia, you're the pro on this webinar. How are we doing? I see we're doing okay on time. Pacing, are we going too fast, too slow? How are we doing?
I think we're doing great, but you got me in the mindset where I'm picking MMM because I cannot parallel park. So when you're looking at me being between the lines, MMM is where I fall. But I do need to find a parking spot every time I'm in Atlanta. So MTA is still there, and I know you're going to cover that right now.
Absolutely. So, when we're and I'm sitting here, I don't have a fancy studio. This is literally my MacBook Air on my home desk here. So, I am staring directly at the camera, but sometimes it looks like I'm looking off to the side. So we've talked a little bit about MTA. We've talked a little bit about marketing mix models. How about we bring these things together? When I was growing up, I love Reese's peanut butter cups. They used to have these commercials, your chocolate and my peanut butter, and together it's better. So it's not an either or, it's an and a plus. So we've got the MTA, which is, great for early stage companies. It honestly, I'm into small business marketing, right? I mean, my agency, we have 12 people. We generally focus in the Atlanta area, and specifically South Atlanta area. So if you're ever in the neighborhood, look us up. Um, Contact me. I'll give you a little tour over at the Trilith Movie Studios, and you can come visit the office. We really are, like our name suggests, we're just some down home folks that just enjoy what we do. And attribution modeling is typically how we have worked with clients. You do this and here's what's going on, and we can track the campaign level. But we've started to lean more into the marketing mix model because a lot of times there are factors that, you know, you plant a seed, you do something, and it has that lingering effect. And we won't get into all the math of that, but some of you that are more mathematically inclined can kind of think about that. You've got concepts like weighted averages and exponential smoothing and a bunch of other neat little tools and techniques that you can account for things and weight them toward future or past time periods. Well, you can put all of this into this triple M model and get a really cool, sophisticated view about what's working and not, but it's not granular. So what if we took both of those approaches, the bottom up MTA, the top down triple M, and we're going to add one other thing to this. And because this is a webinar and we're not interactively talking, I can't, interact with you directly. But this is my dramatic pause, right? I would pause here for effect and just say that these things are good for measuring what's going on. But how can we actually begin to establish some correlation that helps us determine perhaps that word causation? How can we actually say, if we do this, this is what's going to result? And we have to be very careful. We have to be very precise in our measurements, right? And so that's where we add in something called incrementality, where we do various types of testing to establish that sort of, is it the market we're in? Is it the seasonality? We do, various A/B testing. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. And so we put all this together. And now the new term that I want you all to walk away with is unified measurement. And that is the attribution, the media mix models, and this incrementality testing or experiments so that we get a top down, a bottom up, and we can start to establish some causation.
Joe, let me interrupt you real quick and kind of comment on the media versus marketing mix. I feel like there's a lot of confusion or kind of substitution, which, something that I'm guilty of in this deck of media for marketing. Is it media mix modeling or marketing mix modeling? And for the audience, I want you guys to think about this. When it's media mix modeling, ultimately you take all of your digital data by channel over a period of time, right? And you look at how all of this works against the baseline. When it's marketing, you go beyond just digital media. You go and look at, maybe you run outdoor advertising, maybe you put stuff on, bus shelters or something. I worked for a company that did that. I also worked for a company that sponsored a Daytona car. How do you figure out ROI from a race car sponsoring? Your logo is on the car. Our guy did not win. He was always fourth. But anyways, I hear people sponsor Formula One and whatnot. So you would bring all of that into the mix, and it kind of broadens it up and becomes marketing mix modeling. So that's kind of for the context.
Yep, very very good. So let's actually dive into some more details for this. And I'm looking at the time. We're doing great on time, and let's zoom back in. So we've defined some terms. Now let's peel back the layer and see what's in there. So if you look at this awesome slide that Nadia put together, it's a time series model. And what we mean by time series is that, along the x-axis, that's typically at the bottom, you're measuring time. And, we established earlier that a good rule of thumb for a model like this is at least 2 years of data. Okay. I've seen them be effective with less than 2 years, but typically you have more data points. So the thing that we're most concerned with is we need enough data there to be able to see things going on. We can't have all right, we've got, you know, 2 years of data, but we only have it in quarterly buckets. That's not dense enough. On the other hand, I have seen where I have done this myself. I have taken, 90 days worth of very seasonal data, but I had it down into, 3 time periods in the day, and so if you spread that all out, we had enough to work with. So when you look at that, that's kind of the bottom, the time series, and then, of course, along the y-axis, these are the things that we're measuring against the time there, and for the most part, we're tracking sales revenue. That's actually what people are most concerned with when we're talking about. We said this at the very beginning of the webinar. The creative team gets all the fun. Us analysts, we have all the responsibility of making the numbers work. And hopefully, if everything happens right, we can measure these things. What's really cool about modeling this way is that it pulls in, just by the very nature of time series analysis, external factors. Okay. So things that we know happen and impact the market are very hard to quantify traditionally, but with a model like this, you really can do that. And so even though we've established you might not be able to track it down to the specific campaign, we can see, I'm looking at that blue box on the right there, the marketing impact, the positive layers that are driven by all these marketing activities. And so, again, breaking this down, you've kind of got the base, and that may be sales that we were going to get anyway without marketing, right? And then we have external things that are going on, which, seasonality, and it's Christmas or it's not. There are many businesses that like make most of their revenue in a month or two. I've got a company who's a roofer, right? He puts roofs on houses. Their number one external factor is storm damage. When there's storm damage, they don't, they can't even keep up with the demand. But right now, here in Georgia, we haven't had a lot of rain, we haven't had a lot of storms, and so it's a bit slim pickings. And then, of course, you have the marketing impact, which is kind of what we're interested in. We're all marketers here. So when we look at marketing, there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice what we do. You've got business to business, business to consumer, that's the B2C. You've got B2G, business to government. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways of kind of looking at this. But when you're looking at kind of a funnel approach, what we're interested in, if you're a B2C, is measuring that tangible revenue. In B2B, in many cases, you're measuring leads. Ultimately, we're interested in revenue, but for a lot of B2C, I can say this because that's me, right? I own a marketing agency and my clients are other businesses. We're interested in, other conversion goals like leads generated. Because if somebody contacts me, as much as I would love to be able to just quote a simple price, what we do is not that simple. And so it requires configuration and customization and that sort of thing. We get into the relationship, and I don't think that can be overstated. It is so important that, whether it's B2B or B2C or anything, that, you factor in that relationship part. Somebody smart once told me, people buy from people they trust. And I actually, the last time I was in grad school, I sold life insurance. I learned firsthand how to sell directly. And I know when people bought from me, I thought it was my good looks or charm. But at the end of the day, it's just because they trusted me. Then we get into, if we're kind of comparing the challenges of these, the sales cycle. Typically, not always, but typically, in a consumer type of sale, you can see I like to talk with my hands, so I'm not gonna keep them off screen. I'm sitting here talking with my hands. A B2C typically has a shorter sales cycle. In some cases, especially if it's commodity product, it's, you hit the high buttons and boom, they're going to buy. B2C can take a while. I know in preparing for this, Nadia and I were talking, and some of their sales cycles are quite long. I'm a small business. We work with mostly small, medium businesses. Most of my sales cycles are 3 months from the time I start talking to somebody to, whether to do business with us. The longest sales cycle I've ever had was a year and a half. And, I pitched a marketing project to a dental office, didn't hear anything, set it aside. A year and a half later, the dentist called me and said, "I'm ready." And I was like, "Who are you?" I had to go back into my emails and try to remember who this person was. And I tell you, that whole experience led to me putting dates on proposals and offers. Until then, I don't want somebody pulling something up from 10 years ago and say, "Okay, we're ready to buy." And people look at the price there and go, "Oh no." So, it does depend then, when we're talking about marketing analytics, are we talking B2B or B2C?
And Joe, I think that's what boils it down to, this notion of or MMM requiring so much data, which is widely available for anything that is e-commerce. Think how many transactions you will have per day, how many people check out if you're, moving stuff in volumes like Amazon, right? You will have all of your rows and all of your columns, and you will have it nicely formatted. In B2B, when you look at revenue, you may have, I don't know, 200 deals per year, 500 deals per year, large deals. That's amazing, but 500 may not even be enough. So that's the disparity of scale.
Absolutely, and it really does matter, who your audience is, and in many cases you might do both, but in those cases you might actually have different marketing teams. So let's talk a little bit about a potential use case here, and make these concepts be a little bit more tangible, more realistic. So in this example, we've got a 70% budget cut, but the leads were only reduced by 10%. Now, this actually, at first blush, you might look at it and, say, "Hey, a B2B company throws a lot of money at Google search, you know, demand capture rather than demand generation." But, it actually matters what's going on in the economy, right? When, the economic climate changed in 2023, cutting the budget proved that, some of the spend, that was, capturing leads, they may have been coming organically anyway. And so, we have to be careful as, marketing analytics people to give good advice and understand the big picture of what's going on, and see if we're looking at kind of an attribution model. um we might miss this, but if we're using the media mix model, um we can actually measure some of these other effects that we were talking about. And so in this case, the company was overpaying demand that was already gonna get anyway, right? And that can actually be a significant pain point if you're spending money, to take credit for customers who were already coming your way. I actually see that quite a lot. Companies get stuck. Hey, we need to spend X number of dollars on pay per click, and they're not really looking at the numbers. Okay, if we spend 100,000 on it each month, and we're happy with the demand, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And so not only can you use models like this to help justify things, in terms of more investment, in some cases you might find you're actually overpaying, which is what this example is kind of saying. So, let's talk about a halo effect. I love this term. When you look at, a halo, and, the term comes from, it kind of lights up everything, and kind of has an effect that, goes beyond what that immediate, area is. Um, you know, let's say that you're focusing on a new product and you're spending a lot of money advertising it there, um, that halo effect may cause some positive benefit elsewhere, right? Or, you might have an awesome brand. I know for me as a small business owner, there is a bit of a halo effect that we get just from sheer longevity and our branding. We've had a lot of fun with our Country Fried Creative branding, and so when we put that on things, it really helps. It's a two-way street. Um, sometimes, people kind of get stuck in the way they see you or your products or your services. So, but using this way of measuring marketing really can kind of capture that halo effect that an attribution model may not. So that's why, another good reason to have this in the toolkit. All right. All right. So now this is the unsexy part of modeling and marketing and things like that. When you get into data, um, you know, we live in a data-driven world. I love numbers. I love data. Data is awesome. We need it, but at times it can be frustrating. A classic problem in marketing analytics is not having enough data or having too much or having it in a form that is not useful. So you have to clean it and build your pipelines. And when we're talking about a triple M model, particularly a B2B, here are a couple different categories to kind of think about. The actually the spend, I think that's kind of a no-brainer. Whatever, customer relationship management, that's what CRM means. I think most people know that, but there may be some on here who don't. You want information from that, the conversion data and, the dates and what's going on there. The web and engagement. Now, I got my start, ladies and gentlemen, in marketing. I did not set out to be a marketer. In the late 90s, when I was working for IBM, I got into websites and managing web projects. So I came to marketing through websites. And so, I always like to make the joke, the original OG form of website analytics. Some of you are not going to know what I'm talking about here in a minute. And some of you are going to laugh. Is the good old site counter, at the bottom of the website. You are visitor number X. That was the original website metric to track. And let me let you in on a secret as somebody who used to set those up. Nobody ever starts those counters at 1. It was a piece of code and you could even, add to it. So every click was worth 5 or whatever. So, not a very honest way to measure traffic, but it was one of the original ones there. And then of course you've got the external factors, which I've really started to get involved in myself, measuring, different things that pertain to the economy and you know, as I was telling you about my roofing client, strong correlation, external factor, between his business and the weather. If there's a storm, he's going to put more roofs on. And, some people are, interest rate driven and some by consumer confidence. And it really just depends. But, when you look at all the ingredients and think of these as ingredients, the more you have on purpose, the more you've got to work with. But let me flip the script on that and just say that my general philosophy when it comes to analytics and data is to start small, be boring on purpose, get it right, and then add to it. I have seen so many data projects crash under the weight of trying to handle all the data. So a simple model that is understandable and gets used is superior to a large model that nobody understands and is hard to interact with. There is a very large, well-known company here in the Atlanta area. Um, I'm not going to name names, but they have this massive machine learning model to predict demand, and they have well over 1,000 independent variables. And y'all, uh-uh. Most data scientists would look at that and go, "That, yeah, yeah, you got too many there." So, probably, best to start small. Align it with what's going on in your business in terms of, how do people buy from you, the funnel or the customer journey, we sometimes call it. Make sure that your stakeholders are on board. I'm going to be honest there. I get it. Your CEO or your C-level people, and I am one. So of a small company. They may not give this the attention it needs. A lot of times you get the head nod and, yeah, Joe, whatever. Um, you know, don't make everything have to be top importance. Really, when you're talking with your stakeholders, focus on what's really important. We have talked about, we're not going to get too deep into the math of, what adds stock and decay, but just remember that, things tend to have a lingering effect. It is important to calibrate your model, and that's where you can kinda do experiments to see how accurate it is. And, you know, last little, best practice for this, make sure you update your model. I saw a model once where they just forgot to update interest rates, and that was a big, predictor variable into their model, and I was looking at it, and I'm like, "Interest rates have, come down a little bit." "Oh, yeah, we forgot," and they changed that one thing and the whole model changed. So don't forget to, to do that. I think, we won't spend a lot of time on this slide. We've kinda talked about it early on. You've got your baseline, you've got your incremental, what's changing, and then you've got all these external, factors. Okay, cool stuff. I promised you some math. Nadia insisted that we have some math. I'm a math guy, so I did not object to this. It may look intimidating what's going on here, but just remember it's just a formal way of asking what part of this result that we're measuring was us, what part was the market, and that there's always a little error term at the end, and I call that the noise, or what part of this was weird, right? And so you really, the coefficients are just a fancy term of putting weighting on this. And so when we're doing this analysis, that's what we're trying to figure out, how do we adjust this so we know what contribution each of these things is making to sales here. So that's all a regression is. There are lots of different types of regressions, and they're fun and they're easy to do. They can be complicated to do, but at the end of the day, you're just trying to find that line or that shape that kind of connects the dots there, and helps you understand what contributes to it. And then you might actually, do a little bit of predictive analytics with it. So we won't get into all the different ways to validate models, and R squared and ANOVA and all the other good stuff. That is fun. If you want to know more, got a bunch of articles in that in my blog.
And I think the one takeaway is, we were working on this, putting this together, that I want you guys to remember. Like, there's a lot of build versus buy conversation right now for everything, right? People want to build things. There's, Claude out there enabling you to strap AI to your back and be invincible. The management part is what makes it or breaks it, because things will be changing. Joe, you were talking about a variable that somebody forgot to change or make a variable. They hard coded the interest rate, right? So it's that continuous maintenance and paying attention, and really, being married to it, for better, for worse, for the end of your, till the end of your career at the company. So I think that's the main thing here. There is complexity. It is doable. I love Excel and I love the data tool pack. And I used it for one of my previous grad school projects, and we ran regression analysis. I didn't know at the time that I was actually doing MMM. I just figured I needed something for this project that will predict the sales at the end because it was business school. But it's the management piece of the live data that's coming in that will be, I think, the most kind of draw on people's time.
Absolutely. And, no presentation would be complete without, going back to, data quality and cleaning and all that stuff. I think most of you, we could spend all afternoon talking about this. Let me just, kind of add some humor in here with an analogy. Data cleaning is a lot like flossing. You don't normally let everybody on LinkedIn know about it, but you ignore, flossing and brushing your teeth. Now, later on, you're going to have problems. And you build that model and it looks great. And okay, go forth and do great things. If you haven't taken care of these things, and particularly missing values, you're gonna have problems later on. And so it's best to, as Barney Fife, says in Mayberry, Andy, we gotta nip it in the bud. We gotta nip, you gotta nip it in the bud and make sure these things are taken care of. And it is, maybe less glamorous than the other stuff. Well, speaking of glamour, I want to, talk about using Excel, and Nadia just alluded to this. And my younger brother, Dr. Chris Domaleski, he actually has a PhD in statistics. Um, his quote, which I've used, if you can't do an Excel, you probably shouldn't do it. Um, Excel really, spreadsheets, love them, hate them. Um, are really the workhorse of this profession, and you really can do so much. And there is very sophisticated statistical tools in Excel. Now, lately, I have been doing some things with Python notebooks and R, and Nadia's getting all equipped to do some cool things. But when it comes right down to it, most of what we need to do, can be done in Excel. And so, don't overlook what's right there already on your desktop. These are just a few of the things that you can, keep in mind as you're building. I do have an article on my blog, Marketing Data Science, that actually talks step by step how to do regression in Excel. 4 simple, things here. Turn on the tool pack, set up the data table. You can run the regression. There's 3 different ways you can actually do that in Excel. We won't cover that here. And then read the output summary. And I will tell you, yeah, there are some AI tools that can, help with some of this. But let me caution you, AI still isn't a great tool for interpretation to a human audience that doesn't actually know what this stuff means. And so it can actually run some good math. It can put together some models for you, but it's not really good at explaining that to your C-level people. So your job's safe and secure. These tools actually can kind of, help you. Here's some example statistics and stuff that you might get out of your model that, okay, what is this stuff here? And is very useful. Let's talk before we run out of time, about some advanced ways to do this. And I've actually been doing a little bit of research on this recently. I actually turned in a paper. I decided some of the research I was doing, I would just go ahead and um, use it for schoolwork, Nadia. So in the DMSL class, I actually did a head-to-head comparison between 2 of the most common open source marketing mix model frameworks. One of them is Google's Meridian. It does take a Bayesian approach, not a frequentist approach, to statistics. And I don't know if you've covered that in one of your hitchhiker's guides, but that would be a fun topic to talk about, kind of the difference between the frequentist and the Bayesian approach to statistics.
We need to
It's
serve popcorn for that one. That
there
just
you go. That one could be a really fun and interesting one. Read a couple of my blogs and get to know me. And I would invite anybody. I do a lot on LinkedIn. You're welcome to look me up and send me a connection request. And unless you're just trying to sell me some garbage, I'm likely to say yes. And that way you can learn more about me than you ever cared to know about. But um, you know, these are some really cool tools. They actually can work, right off the shelf. There's a GitHub there. It has the built-in ad stock and saturation. What's cool about Meridian is it does kind of understand um, what you're trying to do. It has a budget optimizer. So not only does it kind of, do this regression and sampling and whatnot, it also works on things other than Google Ads. You look at a lot of these tools and you go, "Oh, okay, it only works with their stuff." And that's, not actually, true. The other part is, it actually is able to segment different regional areas, which is, really cool for a model. There are other open source, tools out there. Um, Meta has one called Robin. It's actually an older tool. Um, you know, all of these tools, when you look at them, you've kind of got this one's, for Meridian, all these different steps. I will tell you, if you try to run it without, tuning it or adjusting it, um, you're not going to get, super results with it. So here's some things that you kind of want to think about when you're running these models. You can't just kind of, turn it on and think it's going to, come up with the answer to life, universe, and the everything, which we all know is 42. But, you know, these things, the budget cannibalization. And, we already talked about, throwing money at something that, you were going to get anyway, right? Or measuring the wrong thing. We've all done that. Or inflating the baseline, or even deflating the baseline, right? Um, cross product effects, collinearity and um, confounding variables and things like that. These are all statistical terms, are real and measurable when you use models like this. So be familiar with these pitfalls and how to avoid them. Um, my advice to anybody, getting started is just to get started, right? Just even if it's wrong, you're going to learn through doing, make sure you've got enough data to work with. Um, it is harder and harder to do attribution tracking, with AI search and cookies, all the opt-ins and opts-out and some private browsing. It really is hard. There's gaps in that attribution model that, marketing mix model, the regression actually, it doesn't care. Keeping it simple. Don't be like the company that I alluded to that had 1,000 different predictors. Find a handful of them and figure out what's meaningful and run the test, and you'll actually see. And then, finally, I'm a small business. I like tinkering with things. It's fun to tinker. If I had to build, even with Meridian, a model for a client, I'd probably go, wow, there's probably something off the shelf that could help, do this a little bit better. And, and that's definitely the case. That always, should I make it or buy it? But if you're learning it, man, it's hard to beat just kind of rolling up your sleeves and learning enough about it, which is kind of what I'm doing in school. I'm not going to be doing that. I've got a marketing agency to run, but I've had fun learning it. So let's bring this all together before we run out of time and talk about the unified marketing measurement. Okay. So we establish early on that, hey, we've got street level tracking, we've got satellites in space, we're measuring how well Nadia's parking in downtown Atlanta. Um, Man, if we can just kind of have multiple views on things, we're going to have a lot better, decisions. And so, putting all these things together and, doing what needs to be done to, track what's going on kind of looks something like this if you were to kind of put it from strategic to tactical. The media mix modeling, love it, very useful. I'm going to be honest, it's a little bit more technical than the attribution. And so, take care to learn how that works so you can explain it in a non-technical way to your stakeholders. Attribution, again, that's kind of the OG way of tracking. And I even, gave the example of an old site counter when we're talking about web analytics. It doesn't get any more OG than that. And that's something people can understand. And I think, explainability is important in a model. Then the engagement metrics. And, we're talking about, things that, buying signals and, things that are important, not just vanity metrics. I posted in the spare time I don't have, I'm a ham radio operator, and I posted a YouTube. I was actually downloading images from the International Space Station. I really am that much of a nerd. You can look me up on YouTube and see the video. Well, this doggone video, which was unproduced, it's a video short, 1.5 million views in a week. And I asked my creative director, Janine, who really is a whiz at this stuff, and so much. She's a vice president in our business. I said, Janine, I can't figure it out. It's not edited. It's just a picture of a radio decoding images. And she, was applied the media mix modeling to what I was doing and said, Joe, how about the Artemis mission? Everybody's interested in space now. So there was that seasonal effect, if you will, on a dumb video that I posted that's 30 seconds in length, and it's gotten all these views and hits and hilarious comments. Yeah, Janine, you're right. So even without doing the math, right, we kind of understand some of this. And then of course, funnel metrics, gets very tactical and very important when we're looking at all this. So we are rounding the corner near the end, and I'm going to hand it back to our hostess with the mostest here. At the end of the day, it's very important to have dedicated ownership, on these things, and you need to have multiple levels of understanding. These models can get very complicated very quick. I like the advice of starting small, find a project, just kind of jump right in, learn how this stuff works. But there are better tools that are out there that, you can kind of pull off the shelf that will help you. Got attribution, you got media mix modeling, you've got the experiments which kind of validate causality, and you put all that together and you have what? You have a unified marketing model. So let me hand it back to Nadia for questions and follow-up.
Thank you, Joe. That was phenomenal. And you guys probably wonder, why in the world did we bring up Excel? We're not trying to date ourselves here, right? But ultimately, to Joe's point, what we see at CaliberMind, and we started in the world of multi-touch attribution. We're launching marketing mix modeling here within our tool, which is based on Google Meridian framework. What we see, the hardest thing that people do not have the time, the expertise, the kind of the patience for, is not the model itself. It's not the visualization. It's the data work. It's figuring out the data collection, modeling the data, bringing it together, and then tuning the model. Because like Joe said, seasons change, so do models and what they show, right? So there's a resource out there, build versus buy, with some thoughts. There's a form, so be prepared to put your email address in there, promise you, we do not do sales follow-up for people who just want to learn. We just want to make sure that no free Gmails get these resources. But it gives you some ideas what you're in for when you're building things. Nothing wrong with it. You can start with Excel. That actually gives you an idea of the complexity of what you will see and gives you kind of the baseline to explain it to others when you kind of create it within the world of confines of Excel. But back to the original point of all of this. No one thing will help you tell the story. Yes, privacy is real. Yes, you will only get 60%, 70%, whatever that number is of your data when you're trying to map it to account, person, opportunity. But what if you do not use the 60, 70%? What else do you have, right? Like you don't have a choice. You use that data to make directional decisions. You use marketing mix modeling for the overall view of how your marketing is performing. What if you're blessed with a $5 million budget? You got to figure out how much of that goes here, there, everywhere. And it's really hard to do when you're looking at the granular level. So with this, Joe, thank you so much for being here. This was super delightful. I'm glad
this was
bring
a blast.
someone
We'll have to do it again and talk more, science
We will
fiction.
talk about all of the different models. You suggested it. Bayesian versus something else. Like it's going to be
Frequentist.
enlightening.
Yeah, frequentist. And yeah, that's good stuff. And I am such a geek. For those of you in the Atlanta area, I just put my LinkedIn there. Come hang out with us at Dragon Con. That's my wife goes. We even dress my dog up for that. So we have a lot of fun. That's Labor Day weekend in Atlanta, big science fiction convention.
That sounds amazing. And for all of you guys who are following this event, let me tease up the next episode. We're going to talk about what a lot of you have lived being on the marketing side, starting at a new company when everything is broke. What do you do within the first 90 days? So we're shifting gears here. Like we talked about measuring things when you already got things underway to doing something where nothing is in place and you expect it to own the narrative. So another good friend of mine, Ali Rastiello, will come join us. Ali just started as Senior Director of Marketing Ops at Plural Sites. She will share the story, a survival guide, really, of what to do within the first 90 days and how to get to the point where you actually have a story to tell and you are gearing up to build or make a proposal for multi-touch attribution or marketing mix modeling framework or whatever it might be. Thank you all so much for being here. Again, get your resources.
Thank you.
Joe, thank you.
Thanks.
We'll see you next. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.